The valley lay hidden beyond a stretch of twisting back roads, the kind of place where cell service vanished and silence pressed against the glass of the car windows. For the Morgan family, it was supposed to be a weekend escape, a few days off the grid before the children returned to school. Neighbors remembered them loading their SUV with camping gear, coolers, and sleeping bags. By late Friday afternoon, they were seen passing through the small town that bordered the mountains, stopping for fuel and a few last-minute supplies. Witnesses recalled the father joking with the clerk, the mother checking a paper map, the children laughing in the back seat. There was nothing unusual about the moment, except for the fact that it was the last time anyone in town would ever see them alive. The road they took wound up into a valley notorious among locals for its remoteness. It was the kind of wilderness where storms swept through without warning and trails crumbled into steep ravines. Some hunters swore the land carried its own presence, but for most it was simply a forgotten stretch of country, beautiful yet unforgiving. As daylight faded, the Morgans' SUV was spotted one last time by a rancher driving home along the ridge road. He told investigators he remembered the vehicle turning down the gravel track toward the forest, headlights disappearing beneath the trees. After that, there were no more sightings, no more calls, no more sign of the family. When relatives couldn't reach them by Sunday evening, concern turned to panic. The following morning, deputies were dispatched, beginning what would become one of the most extensive searches the county had ever attempted. Their first discovery came quickly. Parked neatly near a trailhead, the family's SUV sat untouched. Inside, investigators found personal belongings that raised immediate questions: cell phones, chargers, a cooler still half full. Even the children's jackets were left behind. Nothing appeared stolen or broken. The car keys rested in the center console. It looked as though the family had stepped out with every intention of coming back within hours, but they never did. The scene unsettled everyone who saw it. Normally, missing hikers left behind some sign of struggle, a broken window, or at least clear tracks leading into the woods. Here, nothing felt disturbed. Deputies noted faint impressions near the start of the trail, but rain had already begun to wash them away. Beyond that, the ground grew hard and rocky, making it impossible to trace their path. Searchers fanned out in every direction, following ridgelines, creeks, and game paths. But there was no trace of the 4 people who had walked away from that vehicle. News spread quickly through the surrounding towns, pulling volunteers into the valley to help. Some were seasoned outdoorsmen, others simply neighbors unwilling to sit idle. Helicopters circled overhead, while dogs were brought in to track scent along the trails. Yet despite the effort, the results were the same. The SUV remained, a silent marker at the trailhead, while the family themselves seemed to have been swallowed by the wilderness. The remoteness of the valley fed the first wave of theories. Some suggested they had wandered too far and become lost in the dense forest. Others feared they had slipped into one of the fast-moving creeks that cut through the canyons, their bodies carried downstream into inaccessible bends. The terrain was rugged enough to make either possibility real. But to those closest to the family, these explanations rang hollow. They were careful people, the kind who planned trips meticulously and never strayed unprepared. Why would they leave phones, jackets, and even food behind if they intended to hike out for long? Investigators examined the SUV for mechanical issues, wondering if it had broken down. But the vehicle started without hesitation, fuel tank nearly full. There was no sign of tampering, no damage to suggest forced entry or theft. Even valuables, wallets, cash, a camera, were still inside. If the family had met with foul play, the usual indicators weren't there. If they had simply wandered off, why abandon everything they might have needed? The unanswered questions left relatives restless and the community uneasy. People began to drive by the trailhead just to look at the abandoned car, as if trying to make sense of it. The valley, once just another wilderness stretch, took on an unsettling character. For searchers, every rustling branch became a possibility, every shadowed hollow a reminder that 4 people had vanished without a trace. In the days that followed, officials doubled their efforts, determined to bring clarity before the trail went cold. But with each hour, the silence of the valley pressed heavier, and the presence of that undisturbed SUV became harder to explain. It was no longer just a missing persons report. It was the beginning of a mystery that would consume investigators, haunt locals, and leave the question of what happened to the Morgan family echoing far beyond the valley floor. The first official search began before dawn, when the sun was just starting to break over the ridges. Dozens of deputies, rangers, and volunteers gathered at the trailhead where the family's SUV still sat untouched. They formed grids, fanning into the valley with radios clipped to their belts and bright markers tied to branches to trace their paths. Helicopters circled overhead, the drone of rotors carrying across the tree line as thermal cameras scanned the forest floor. At ground level, trained dogs were unleashed, noses pressed to the earth, handlers straining to keep pace as they moved quickly into the brush. Everyone expected to find something quickly: a campsite, a dropped bag, a single trail leading deeper into the wilderness. Instead, the woods gave them nothing. Hour after hour, searchers combed ridgelines and creek beds, calling the names of the missing. The dogs barked, pulled, then stilled, circling back with no scent trail to follow. Helicopter crews reported patches of clearings, rocky slides, even shapes that from above looked like tents, only to find boulders or sun-bleached logs upon closer inspection. By the second day, fatigue set in, but the operation grew larger. Neighboring counties sent deputies, volunteer fire crews arrived, and off-duty forest workers offered their knowledge of the terrain. For a brief moment, the valley was flooded with human presence, lanterns glowing against the tree line at night as if a small town had sprung up just for the search. But each morning, when the teams returned from their sweeps, they came back with empty hands. Investigators noted how unusual the silence was. In typical missing hiker cases, there were always traces: a candy wrapper left on the trail, a plastic bottle wedged in a root, a footprint pressed into soft earth. Here, there was nothing. The valley floor, though rugged, was not impenetrable. People expected some indication of human passage, but every direction checked seemed to reset into undisturbed wilderness. Some began to wonder if the family had left the car and been immediately swallowed by an accident, a sudden fall into one of the hidden ravines, or pulled downstream by the river that carved its way through the valley. Search divers were brought in, methodically dragging sections of water, probing deep pools with poles. Days of effort produced no bodies, no clothing, no sign that the family had ever touched the river at all. The cliffs became the next focus. Teams scrambled up and down sheer faces, scouring ledges where perhaps someone might have fallen. Ropes were anchored, helmets strapped tight, every crevice examined. Nothing. Others turned to the caves, of which the valley had dozens, some mapped, others not. These dark openings presented their own risks. Searchers ventured in with headlamps, crawling on their stomachs through narrow passages, calling out in voices that echoed eerily. One ranger recalled the oppressive silence: no answering cry, no flicker of movement, just the cold, damp walls pressing closer. The caves revealed only bats and animal bones, never the family they were desperate to find. As the first week dragged into the second, frustration mounted. Maps of the valley were tacked onto bulletin boards, marked with colored pins and circles that showed where every sweep had been conducted. The maps looked full, but the results were empty. Each evening, relatives gathered at the base camp, faces pale with exhaustion and hope wearing thin. They begged for answers, but investigators had none to give. When asked how a family of 4 could vanish in a contained valley without a single sign, one official could only shake his head. It's like they walked into the trees and the earth closed behind them. By the third week, the search shifted in tone. Fewer helicopters flew overhead. Volunteer numbers dropped as people returned to work. Even the dogs, once so eager, grew restless from running loops that led nowhere. Officials knew resources were running thin, but they also feared declaring the effort over. To stop would be to admit that the valley had beaten them, that 4 people had disappeared into its folds without explanation. At press conferences, sheriffs promised they were still pursuing every lead, still following every clue. Behind closed doors, the investigators admitted what the terrain had begun to suggest: the valley did not want to give anything back. The reputation of the place darkened with each day of failure. Locals began to call it cursed ground, whispering about others who had gone missing in the area over the decades. Hunters recalled hearing cries that never resolved into voices, Hikers spoke of paths that seemed to end suddenly, as if cut off by the mountain itself. The missing family became part of those stories, woven into the valley's growing reputation for swallowing people whole. By the end of the official search, no one could point to a single piece of hard evidence. No campsite, no fire ring, no discarded food. It was as if the family had chosen not to exist the moment they stepped out of their car. Investigators filed their reports, boxed their maps, and told the public they would continue to pursue the case through leads and tips. But for the people who had scoured every ridge, every cave, every river bend, the silence of the valley lingered. The unanswered question was no longer just where the family had gone. It was how a place so thoroughly searched could hide them so completely. In the days after the official search wound down, investigators turned their attention to leads that began trickling in from the surrounding towns. With the family's faces now plastered across news broadcasts and pinned to bulletin boards, the public started reporting anything that might resemble a sighting. At first, the tips brought a spark of hope. A gas station attendant just outside the valley insisted he'd seen a couple with 2 children late on the same Friday night, filling up an older SUV. He described the woman as tired but polite, the man quiet, the kids restless. The description seemed to match, and for a brief moment, investigators thought they had a breakthrough. But when surveillance footage was finally pulled from the store's grainy camera, the family in question turned out to be tourists from another state. They were tracked down, alive and well, leaving no doubt that the sighting had been mistaken. The hope that had swelled collapsed back into silence. Other tips carried even darker tones. A few locals reported rumors of a drifter who had been lingering in the valley earlier that summer. He was said to sleep in abandoned cabins, known for muttering to himself and scaring hikers when he appeared suddenly along trails. Some swore they'd seen him near the road where the Morgan family's vehicle was parked. Detectives followed up, canvassing shelters and towns up and down the highway, searching for any man who fit the description. They eventually tracked one down, a transient who admitted to being in the area but denied any contact with the missing family. He had no belongings that tied him to them, no weapon, no evidence. In the end, he was dismissed as yet another ghost of rumor. His life chaotic, but not connected to the case. The strangest tip came from a nearby town. A woman reported that on the Saturday night after the family was last seen, she'd been working at a diner when she overheard a payphone ring outside. Curious, she later checked the booth and noticed the receiver left swinging, as if someone had abandoned the call midway. According to her, a man's voice had been faintly audible before the line went dead. She claimed it sounded panicked. Investigators tried to trace the call records, but the payphone was old, its system unable to pinpoint the source. Whether the call was connected or just coincidence could never be proven. The diner lid joined the growing pile of unanswered threads. As days turned into weeks, the tips continued. Families reported seeing children resembling the Morgans at playgrounds. A motel clerk swore he'd rented a room to them, and a trucker claimed he saw their SUV hundreds of miles away. Each claim was logged, investigated, and eventually dismissed. The SUV had never left the valley, still sitting where it had been from the start. The missing family had not checked into any hotels, had not withdrawn any money, had not used their phones. It was as if their lives had ended the moment they walked away from the vehicle, leaving the rest of the world untouched by their presence. Detectives began to feel the weight of impossibility. Normally, a disappearance had a pattern: financial troubles, domestic conflicts, or a hidden plan. But background checks showed the Morgans had none of that. They were stable, with jobs, friends, and no indication of wanting to vanish. Their relatives insisted there was no secret they could be running from. Yet with no bodies and no crime scene, investigators struggled to call it foul play. Without footprints or camping debris, they couldn't call it an accident either. Every lead that came through the door dissolved into dead air. The community grew restless. People whispered about abductions, about hidden cults in the hills, about the valley itself being cursed. Conspiracy forums latched onto the case, suggesting government cover-ups or supernatural involvement. But to the investigators on the ground, the strangeness wasn't supernatural. It was procedural. They had followed every step correctly, documented every claim, and yet not one piece of evidence had advanced the story. Each dead lead only underscored the most haunting fact: the valley had offered no clue that the family ever walked into it. Months later, detectives reviewing the case files described the feeling the same way, that the family had simply evaporated after leaving their SUV behind. For seasoned investigators used to trails that eventually led somewhere, this case felt different. Every road bent back into itself. Every call led to nothing. It was a mystery suspended in midair with no weight to pull it down to earth. And as the official investigation slowed, the reality became clear. Without new evidence, the disappearance of the Morgans was destined to join the growing list of unsolved cases, remembered only as the family who walked into a valley and never walked out. With the investigation stalled and no physical evidence to anchor the search, the story of the missing Morgan family shifted from official reports to speculation. The longer the silence stretched, the louder the theories grew. At first, the most common explanation was the river. Locals who knew the valley well described its hidden bends and violent undercurrents. To them, it was easy to imagine the family hiking too close to the water, a child slipping, and the parents diving in after them. One misstep in the wrong place, and all four could have been swept away. Divers had already searched key pools, but many insisted the river was deceptive, with deep pockets and submerged caves where bodies could vanish forever. For those who believed in simple accident, the river was the most logical answer. Yet others weren't convinced. The lack of clothing or debris along the banks didn't fit with a drowning. No footprint suggested the family had even approached the water. That gap fed darker rumors, ones that spread quickly through local bars and late-night conversations. People spoke about an old man who supposedly lived off-grid in the hills above the valley, a recluse who didn't welcome visitors. Some hunters swore they had seen him moving through the trees, carrying an old rifle, disappearing before anyone could speak to him. In this theory, the Morgans had stumbled into his territory and never returned. There was no evidence to support it, but the idea carried weight in a community already uneasy with how thoroughly the family had vanished. As the case drew national attention, speculation spread online. Forums dedicated to mysteries and missing persons began dissecting every detail. Amateur sleuths analyzed maps of the valley, convinced that the SUV's location suggested a planned disappearance. Some argued the Morgans had staged their vanishing, abandoning their lives to start over elsewhere. Others spun stories of cult involvement, pointing to remote areas of the state that had long histories of fringe groups operating in isolation. Even the payphone lead, a single unverified call, was dissected and reframed as proof the family had been abducted and forced to make contact. The lack of clarity turned every detail into potential evidence, no matter how thin. The theories fractured the public into camps. Accident theorists pointed to the valley's unforgiving terrain, emphasizing that wilderness swallowed people all the time. They noted that experienced hikers and hunters had been lost in similar conditions without leaving behind a trace. To them, it was a tragic but natural explanation, a reminder of how small humans were against the vastness of the land. Those leaning toward foul play found that reasoning unsatisfying. They pointed back to the SUV, abandoned with valuables untouched, as if the family had been interrupted. They latched onto the idea of a predator, human, not natural, waiting in the valley for unsuspecting travelers. For the family's relatives, the swirl of speculation was both unbearable and unavoidable. They attended community meetings, listening as strangers debated whether their loved ones had drowned or been murdered. Each theory chipped away at their hope differently. An accident meant their family had died quickly. Their bodies lost to nature. Foul play meant something more deliberate and cruel, a possibility harder to accept, but impossible to rule out. The lack of resolution kept grief suspended, giving no direction for mourning. The sheriff's office tried to tamp down the speculation, releasing carefully worded statements that neither confirmed nor denied theories. But with no new evidence to provide, their silence became fuel for the public imagination. Every rumor, no matter how improbable, found an audience. Reporters highlighted the most dramatic claims, and the valley itself began to take on a sinister reputation. Locals who once hunted or camped there now avoided it, calling it cursed ground. By the first anniversary of the disappearance, the case was no longer just a local mystery. It had become a legend in its own right, a story retold with each new theory layered on top of the last. For some, the Morgans had been claimed by the wilderness. For others, they had been taken by someone living in its shadows. And for many, the lack of answers meant the story could never settle into one version of the truth. Instead, it fractured into possibilities, each as haunting as the silence of the valley itself. As months turned into years, the search for the Morgan family lost its urgency. The initial flood of media coverage dried up, replaced by newer stories, fresher tragedies. What remained was a case file that grew dusty in the sheriff's office and a trailhead that carried the weight of unanswered questions. The SUV had long since been towed and released to relatives, leaving only the dirt pull-off where it once sat. Without that visible reminder, the site became just another entry point into the valley, except for those who knew its history. For them, it would never be just a trailhead. The official investigation slowed to a crawl. Detectives were reassigned, resources redirected, and the valley returned to its quiet state. Yet every year, especially around the anniversary of the family's disappearance, volunteers still arrived. Some were locals who had been part of the original search. Others were strangers drawn by the mystery, determined to find something everyone else had missed. They combed the ridges, traced the river, and pushed into caves. They returned with stories of treacherous footing, near accidents, and the unsettling sense of being watched in the stillness. None returned with evidence. Nature itself seemed to conspire against the search. Each spring brought heavy rains, swelling the river beyond its banks. Floods scoured the valley floor, shifting rocks and sediment, carrying debris miles downstream. Landslides followed in summer, triggered by storms, leaving fresh scars across slopes where once there had been trees. Trails eroded, landmarks shifted, and with them, whatever fragile traces might have remained from that weekend were buried deeper under the constant reshaping of the land. The wilderness was not static. It was alive, moving, and indifferent to the human need for answers. For the Morgan family's relatives, the silence was unbearable. At first, they organized vigils in town, but over time, the gatherings moved to the trailhead itself. Each year, candles and photographs were set against the wooden post, marking the start of the path, a quiet memorial in a place where no bodies had been found. Parents and siblings spoke of refusing to give up, of believing that one day some trace would surface. Yet with each passing anniversary, their voices grew thinner, worn down by the weight of time. Some clung to the idea of survival, that the family had staged their disappearance. Others acknowledged the likelihood of death, but begged for remains to be found, so they could at least bury their loved ones. The community around the valley grew divided in how it remembered the case. To outsiders, it was a mystery frozen in time, a cautionary tale of what could happen in the wilderness. To locals, it became something darker, a legend passed down almost like folklore. Hunters whispered warnings about the valley being a place that took more than it gave. Campers told stories around fires about the family who walked in and never returned. Each retelling added to the weight of the place, giving the land itself a reputation it had never carried before. By the 5th year, the Morgan disappearance was officially cold. Detectives admitted privately there was nothing more to be done without new evidence. Yet the legend ensured it was never forgotten. Journalists occasionally revived the story, bringing cameras to the trailhead, interviewing family members who repeated the same words of hope and heartbreak. Online forums kept threads alive, speculating endlessly about what could have happened, their theories now more elaborate than ever. But in the valley itself, there was only quiet. The wind through the trees, the river grinding its path through rock, the shifting of earth with each storm, all of it carrying on as though nothing unusual had ever occurred. For those who knew the family, the hardest part was not death, but absence. Absence of proof, absence of answers, absence of closure. The silence became a torment in itself, filling birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days with what-ifs. Each passing year was a reminder that time was moving forward while the mystery remained stuck, frozen in the moment the Morgans stepped away from their car. And with no answers, the valley held its place in memory as a hollow in the mountains, a place whispered about with unease, a valley that took but never gave back. 12 years passed before the valley stirred again, with something more than silence and speculation. By then, the Morgan family's disappearance had become less of a headline and more of a hushed legend, known mostly among locals and on internet forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries. The valley remained wild, largely untouched except for the occasional hunter or determined backpacker willing to brave its steep terrain. It was during one such trip that a group of 4 hikers experienced in backcountry expeditions chose to cut through a ravine rarely mapped on trail guides. They were chasing solitude, the kind found only where few others ventured. What they found instead would reopen a case thought to be buried beneath time. The ravine was narrow and jagged, carved by years of seasonal flooding. Fallen rocks littered the ground, forcing the hikers to climb over boulders slick with moss. As they picked their way forward, one of them noticed a shadow that seemed different from the others, a dark hollow, half hidden behind a curtain of stone. At first it looked like nothing more than an indentation, the kind of shallow recesses common in mountain valleys, but as the group drew closer, they realized it was an opening, partially obscured by rockfall from long ago. Curiosity led them to clear away a few stones, enough to slip inside. The cave was shallow, no more than a few dozen feet deep, but the air was colder, heavy with the smell of damp earth. They shined their headlamps across the floor, expecting only dust and rock. Instead, the beams fell on something out of place, a scrap of faded fabric lying against the wall. The color was washed out by time, but it was unmistakably human-made. Just beyond it lay another piece, what looked like a torn strap, frayed and discolored. For a moment they thought it might be the remains of some lost backpacking gear, forgotten by another traveler. But then came the discovery that froze them in place. Against the back wall of the cave, half buried in silt, sat a small shoe. It was weathered, the leather cracked, the sole barely holding together. But its size left little doubt. It belonged to a child. The hikers stared in silence, the weight of what they were seeing pressing down on them. Memories of the valley's most infamous story returned immediately. The missing family, the children who had never been found. The timing was impossible to ignore. None of the hikers spoke for several long minutes. One finally whispered that they needed to get out, to mark the location, to call the authorities. They knew instantly that this was no ordinary find. It was a piece of a story thought lost forever. When they emerged from the ravine, they recorded coordinates on a GPS unit and began the difficult hike back out of the valley. Every step carried an unshakable unease. They had set out seeking quiet wilderness, but instead, they carried with them the evidence of a tragedy. That night, once they reached a town with service, they made the call. Deputies were dispatched, their urgency clear even before the hikers finished explaining. Within hours, law enforcement cordoned off the ravine. For the first time in more than a decade, the valley once again filled with flashing lights, marked paths, and the presence of investigators. The hikers, shaken, recounted every detail. They emphasized the smallness of the cave, how easy it would have been to walk past without ever noticing it. The rockfall that had partly sealed it may have been there for years, masking the opening from earlier searches. Their description of the fabric and shoe left no doubt to detectives. These were not random items. These were relics from a family that had vanished 12 years earlier. The items were bagged carefully, their condition fragile, already compromised by years of exposure. But even fragile, they carried significance. Word spread quickly. For locals, the discovery reignited fears they had long tried to bury. Reporters returned, broadcasting footage of patrol cars lined at the trailhead. The Morgan family's relatives, some still living in the area, were notified of the find. They gathered quietly, their faces marked by a complicated mix of dread and hope. Dread that the rumors of death were true. Hope that at last, after so long, the valley might finally give back some part of what it had taken. Investigators returned to the ravine with specialized teams, prepared to clear more of the rock and search the cave fully. Every move was documented, every stone shifted with care. Yet even before that deeper investigation began, the tone of the case had changed. No longer was it simply a story of disappearance. With the discovery of weathered fabric in a child's shoe, there was now tangible proof. Proof that the family had made it further into the valley than anyone had ever known. Proof that the silence of 12 years was not the end of their story, but a pause before something darker emerged. Deputies wasted no time sealing off the ravine. By morning, the narrow approach was strung with tape and marked by floodlights hauled in on generators, their glow turning the steep walls into a stage for the return of law enforcement. Forensic teams moved carefully into the shallow cave, documenting every inch before shifting a single stone. The air was tense, heavy with the knowledge that this was not just a recovery site. It was the first tangible connection to the Morgans in more than a decade. What had started as scraps of fabric and a child's shoe quickly unfolded into something far more sobering. As investigators sifted through the loose soil and rockfall inside, more items surfaced. A bent aluminum pot, its handle missing, lay pressed beneath a layer of sediment. A shredded sleeping bag, threads clinging to damp earth, hinted at attempts to shelter. Then came the discoveries that silenced even the most hardened professionals. Human remains. At first, it was a small bone, fragile and pale against the dark soil. Then, more, scattered and partially buried, some cracked from the weight of fallen stone. They worked methodically, brushing away silt with delicate tools, collecting each fragment as though piecing together a story the valley had tried to erase. It became clear that the cave had not been a simple hiding place. Soil analysis revealed evidence of multiple rockfalls over the past decade, layers of debris that had likely concealed the site during earlier searches. Geologists on scene explained how seasonal storms could have loosened sections of the cliff above, collapsing stone into the entrance and burying anything within. To investigators, it explained the haunting question of how an area so thoroughly searched in the early days had yielded nothing. The family hadn't escaped detection by chance. They had been hidden by the land itself. The condition of the remains made identification difficult at first. Forensic anthropologists cataloged each fragment, laying them out with painstaking care. Clothing scraps were tested, bone samples taken. Days stretched into weeks as evidence traveled to state labs for DNA analysis. In the meantime, detectives combed through what was left in the cave: rusted utensils, a broken lantern, fabric consistent with children's clothing. Each object was photographed, bagged, and logged, forming a fragile chain back to the Morgans. The breakthrough came with the DNA results. One set of remains matched the family's youngest child, a daughter just 7 years old when she vanished. The confirmation hit like a wave, sorrow, relief, and horror colliding all at once. After 12 years of absence, there was finally proof that at least one member of the Morgan family had not left the valley alive. For the relatives who had endured more than a decade of not knowing, it was the answer they both longed for and feared most. The little girl's life had ended in darkness, in a cave buried beneath stone. The confirmation reignited the case in full. What had become a cold file suddenly demanded immediate attention. Detectives returned to old leads, pulling dusty reports from storage, questioning once-dismissed witnesses. They sought to understand how the family had ended up in that cave. Had they entered willingly, seeking shelter from a storm? Had someone forced them there? The presence of camping gear suggested preparation, but the scattered bones told a harsher story, one of entrapment, collapse, and time's cruelty. Media outlets descended on the valley once again, their cameras capturing the grim procession of evidence bags carried from the ravine. Locals who had long considered the case unsolvable found themselves drawn back into its orbit, speculating on what might be uncovered next. For some, the cave was proof that the Morgans had suffered an accident, trapped by nature's indifference. For others, it raised darker possibilities. Why had only the child's remains been identified so far? Where were the others? The cave became more than a discovery site. It was a crime scene, a grave, and a window into 12 years of silence. And as investigators pressed forward, the sense deepened that this was only the beginning, that the cave held more than just fragments of bone and gear. It held the key to unraveling what had really happened in the valley that summer, a truth that had been waiting, buried, for over a decade. Detectives approached the rediscovery of the Morgans' case with renewed intensity, but with it came a resurgence of the old unanswered questions. The cave had given investigators their first concrete evidence in 12 years, but it also raised unsettling new possibilities. The placement of the camping gear, the scattered bones, and the condition of the entrance all hinted at a story that was incomplete. Some specialists argued that the family could have taken shelter from one of the sudden storms that routinely ripped through the valley, only for a rockslide to seal them inside. Others, however, pointed to inconsistencies. Why had no one tried to dig their way out? Why were some items positioned oddly, as if disturbed rather than left behind? And why was only a portion of the family accounted for when all four had vanished together? To answer these questions, detectives began retracing old theories. They revisited the earliest reports of a reclusive drifter in the valley, a man rumored to stalk trails with a rifle slung over his shoulder. At the time, no connection had been proven, and he had faded into the haze of discarded leads. Now, with evidence finally recovered from the cave, those whispers returned to the forefront. Interviews were conducted with locals who had once dismissed the rumors. Many admitted, reluctantly, that they had heard gunshots in the hills during that summer. A few recalled uneasy encounters with a stranger who fit the description. In the absence of clear answers, the idea of human involvement became harder to ignore. The case took a darker turn when forensic teams conducting a second sweep of the cave unearthed an object that had gone unnoticed during the initial recovery. A rusted hunting rifle wedged deep into a crevice along the wall. The weapon was badly corroded, its barrel pitted, and its stock warped from years of exposure. Yet, it was unmistakable. Firearms experts quickly confirmed that it was not registered to any member of the Morgan family. For investigators, the implications were chilling. If the Morgans had entered the cave voluntarily to seek shelter, why would there be a weapon hidden there that did not belong to them? The rifle was carefully extracted and tested. Though erosion had stripped most identifiers, serial numbers were partially recovered. They traced back to a purchase made decades earlier by a man with a record of trespassing and violence, a man who, according to old county reports, had once lived off-grid in the hills bordering the valley. He had since passed away, leaving behind only fragments of his life, but the association was enough to jolt the investigation. Detectives were left to wonder if the Morgans had crossed paths with him on that weekend, whether by chance or by confrontation. Theories shifted almost overnight. For years, the prevailing belief had been that the family succumbed to the wilderness, drowned in the river, lost in the cliffs, or trapped by a natural disaster. Now, with the rifle in hand, speculation turned sharply toward foul play. If someone had forced the family into the cave, it would explain the eerie arrangement of belongings, the lack of attempts to escape, and perhaps even why only partial remains had surfaced. The land might have hidden them, but the weapon suggested a human hand had orchestrated their fate. Locals who once brushed off the darker rumors began to reconsider them. Stories of strange lights, of footsteps echoing at night, of hunters glimpsing a figure watching them from the tree line, resurfaced with new weight. People who had once sworn the valley was simply dangerous wilderness now admitted they felt something more deliberate in the way the family had disappeared. The legend of a cursed valley transformed into something far more human, the possibility that it had been guarded by someone willing to kill to keep it isolated. For the Morgan relatives, the discovery of the rifle was devastating. It reopened grief that had dulled into resignation. The thought that their loved ones might not have simply been victims of nature, but of cruelty, left scars deeper than before. Investigators kept their language measured, careful not to claim more than the evidence allowed, but privately, many admitted the case no longer felt like an accident. The cave was no longer just a grave concealed by rockfall. It was now a possible crime scene, stained not only with time, but with intent. What began as whispers of storms and rivers now spiraled into something far darker. The rifle had shifted the weight of the story, bending it toward human darkness rather than nature's indifference. And as detectives pressed deeper into the revived case, they knew that the next answers wouldn't come from the valley itself, but from the shadows left behind by the people who once called it home. The cave, once dismissed as a shallow hollow in the stone, kept giving up pieces of a story that had been buried for 12 years. Forensic teams working through the layers of debris began to notice a disturbing pattern in the remains. The bones, when analyzed, carried stress fractures consistent with falls on steep terrain. Some showed signs of prolonged malnutrition, the brittle texture of calcium-starved bodies suggesting weeks of deprivation rather than sudden death. These details painted a picture not of a family lost in an instant, but of people who had endured, suffered, and then splintered apart in their struggle to survive. Further excavation revealed more scattered evidence deeper in the sediment, a length of rope frayed at both ends, fragments of canvas that had once been part of a tent, and bones found farther from the main cluster, as though at least one member of the family had ventured beyond the cave after the others could no longer move. Investigators pieced together a timeline. At first, the family must have sheltered together, possibly driven into the cave by a storm or by someone who forced them there. But as time passed, desperation grew. At least one of them tried to leave, perhaps in search of food or an escape. The skeletonized remains told the rest. No one had made it far. The most haunting discovery came not from bone or fabric, but from paper. Lodged between rocks in a dry pocket of the cave, remarkably preserved, was a torn journal page. Its edges were brittle, its lines warped with faint water stains, but the handwriting remained clear enough to read. Analysts compared it to known samples from the family's belongings, and the match was undeniable. It was the father's. The words scrawled across it carried the panic of a man pushed past the limits of reason. He wrote about footsteps outside the cave at night, about the sense of being watched. He mentioned hearing movement near the entrance, whispers he could not place, and the conviction that they were not alone in the valley. The final lines trailed off mid-thought, as though interrupted, but their meaning was chilling. He waits for us. I think he wants us to... The page ended there, the rest lost to time. The journal fragment electrified the investigation. For a decade, theories had swung between natural accident and staged disappearance. Now, the father's own words suggested something else entirely: the presence of a predator. Detectives couldn't dismiss the possibility that fear and hunger had distorted his perception, but coupled with the discovery of the rifle, the implications were impossible to ignore. The Morgans hadn't just been swallowed by wilderness, they had believed they were being hunted. Forensic evidence supported the theory of pursuit. The placement of bones outside the cave indicated at least one member tried to flee. Stress fractures hinted at desperate movement across treacherous terrain, perhaps while being chased. Exposure and starvation finished what injury began. The conditions of the cave, items scattered rather than neatly placed, suggested panic more than order. Combined, these details formed a narrative that aligned with the father's writing. The family had felt cornered, stalked by someone who knew the valley better than they did. The discovery sent waves through the community. Locals who had long clung to the accident theory now faced unsettling questions. The whispers about a recluse in the hills, the rifle hidden in the cave, and the journal describing footsteps at night began to knit together into something darker than rumor. For relatives of the Morgans, the fragment was both a blessing and a curse. It was a voice from the dead, proof of their final moments, but it confirmed their worst fears, that the family hadn't simply died in nature's grasp, but under the shadow of human cruelty. Detectives reopened interviews with anyone who had lived near the valley at the time, scouring records for men who matched the pattern described. The reclusive drifter once dismissed returned to the top of their lists. His violent past, his connection to the rifle, and the father's words about footsteps converged into a theory that felt too pointed to ignore. Yet, with the man long dead, the possibility of justice slipped through their hands even as the truth came closer. The cave was no longer just a grave site. It had become a map of fear, each bone and fragment telling the story of a family that had tried to survive under impossible circumstances. And now, with a torn journal page as the most intimate evidence of all, investigators faced the chilling reality that the Morgans had not simply vanished into the wilderness. They had been trapped in it, stalked in it, and ultimately broken by it. The final wave of the investigation carried a weight unlike any phase before. What had once been rumor and speculation was finally hardening into fact, and with that came the uncomfortable task of reconstructing exactly what had happened in the valley all those years earlier. The rifle, recovered in fragments of rust and wood from the cave wall, had always felt like the key. Once technicians restored the corroded serial number, it led investigators to a man whose name had lingered for years in the background of local rumor, but had never been fully tied to the Morgans' disappearance. His name was Raymond Harker. Harker's history was a patchwork of violence, instability, and withdrawal from society. He had spent much of his youth in and out of prison on charges ranging from burglary to aggravated assault. After his last release, he avoided ordinary life altogether. Reports placed him deep in the forests and canyons that bordered the valley, squatting in cabins, building crude shelters, and living on the margins where no one could interfere with him. Those who encountered him often described the same unsettling qualities: a rifle slung across his shoulder, a wild look in his eyes, and a tendency to mutter about the land as if it belonged to him alone. One parole officer remembered him warning that, "People better learn to stay out of my valley." At the time, the remark had seemed like the paranoid rambling of a loner. In hindsight, it sounded like a threat that had foreshadowed tragedy. The forensic evidence told the rest. DNA swabs taken from the rifle stock matched Harker's genetic profile, still on file from prior arrests. Tests on fabric scraps and bone fragments from the cave revealed trace amounts of the same DNA, establishing that Harker had not only carried the weapon, but had been physically present in the cave where the Morgans' remains were discovered. For investigators, the connection was undeniable. The cave was not just a shelter against storms, it was a place where Harker had cornered the family, a trap cloaked by wilderness and time. Detectives reconstructed the sequence of events as best they could. On that Friday evening, after parking their SUV at the trailhead, the Morgans likely set off for a short hike to scout a camping spot. Somewhere along the way, they encountered Harker. Armed and territorial, he confronted them, furious that strangers had crossed into what he saw as his land. The rifle ensured their compliance. Evidence suggests he marched them away from the road, deeper into the valley's labyrinth of ridges and ravines, until they reached the shallow cave. What he intended after that remains uncertain. Some speculated he planned to intimidate them into leaving. Others believed he wanted to isolate them until he could decide their fate. But nature added its own cruelty to the moment. Heavy rain that weekend triggered rock slides across the valley, some of which fell directly at the mouth of the cave. Soil samples confirmed that at least 2 collapses occurred during the time the Morgans would have been alive. Piles of stone sealed them in, blocking their way back out. With no supplies beyond what they carried in their hands, the family was trapped. The journal fragment recovered from the father hinted at those final days, the sense of being watched, the sound of footsteps outside, and the realization that they were being toyed with by a man who circled the cave, ensuring they would not escape. The bones told the rest of the story: signs of malnutrition, stress fractures from attempts to climb or flee, and eventual collapse from exposure painted a grim picture of suffering. At least one member had tried to leave, their remains discovered farther from the others, but the effort ended in the same way. Harker never returned to help, never sought rescue. Instead, he left the Morgans to die, the rockfalls in isolation doing his work for him. The valley became both their prison and their grave. By the time the truth was uncovered, Harker himself was already beyond reach. He had been arrested years after the family's disappearance for an unrelated assault in another county. He served a short sentence before succumbing to illness in prison, taking his secrets with him. He never admitted involvement, never confessed, and never faced accountability for what he had done. Only the rifle and the traces of his DNA told the story he refused to speak aloud. For the Morgan family's surviving relatives, the conclusion brought no peace, only a hollow form of closure. They now knew the truth, that their loved ones had not simply wandered into misfortune or been claimed by nature's indifference. They had been victims of human darkness, of a man whose obsession with isolation had driven him to treat intruders as enemies. Memorials were held at the trailhead, candles glowing softly against the backdrop of the valley. There were no longer prayers for return, only words of remembrance and grief. The valley itself changed in meaning. For years it had been whispered about as cursed land, a place that swallowed people whole. Now it carried a different reputation, a crime scene veiled by wilderness, haunted not by myths but by the violence of a single man. Hikers still pass through it, though far fewer than before, and always with a lingering unease. The silence there seems heavier, as if it carries the memory of the family who entered alive and never returned. In the end, the mystery was solved, but the resolution did not feel like triumph. It was a reminder of how human cruelty can hide in plain sight, disguised as wilderness misfortune. The Morgan story closed not with a miraculous survival or a twist of fate, but with the grim reality that one man's obsession with territory condemned them all. The truth in the cave had been buried for 12 years, concealed by stone and silence, but once unearthed, it revealed the valley for what it was, not cursed, not supernatural, but a place scarred forever by the shadow of human darkness.